Hello, young math Padawans. It's Mrs. Angel with your lesson for today on solving multi-step equations. So multi-step equations are equations that don't just take your normal properties of equality. We have to bring in some other tools from our toolbox here. So let's go through this little solving equations toolbox and talk about how we can tell whether or not we need to use any one of these tools. The first tool is our combining like terms, or CLT. And we can tell that we're going to use that tool if we have like terms on the same side of the equation. So that could mean that we have x's on the same side of the equation, or potentially constants on the same side of the equation. Anything that's on the same side of the equal sign that could be combined and simplified into a single term. The second tool in our toolbox is our distributive property. Now, there's one way that we can tell that we're going to use our distributive property, and that is if you see parentheses. If you see parentheses and specifically a value on the outside, that means that you will be using the distributive property at some point. And finally, we have our properties of equality. Properties of equality are the operations that we do to both sides of the equation to keep it true. And we use these properties to create zero terms and big one factors. So we're going to go through this video using the tools in the toolbox, and we're going to determine which tools we need to use and solve some equations. So grab your notes and let's get started. Okay, so the first equation that we're going to solve using our solving equations toolbox is 15 equals 3x minus 5 plus 2x. Go ahead and write down this equation along with your 3-column proof now. Great. So the first thing I always do is put a line down the middle of my equal sign to keep both sides completely separate. Now I'm going to look at my toolbox and figure out which tools I'm going to use. All right, let's start with combining like terms. Do I see like terms on the same side of the equation? Well, on the right side, I do see a 3x and a 2x, which leads me to believe that yes, I will be using the combining like terms tool at some point in my solving. What about the distributive property? Do you see any parentheses here? I don't, which means we will not be using the distributive property tool in this equation. And then I definitely see some terms with multiplication and addition, so we'll have to use our properties of equality to create some big ones and zero terms. So let's go ahead and take a look at our given equation here. The first thing I'm going to do is combine the like terms that I see. I see a positive 3x and a positive 2x. So I'm going to go ahead and combine or collect those into a single term. 3x's plus 2x's can simplify down to 5x's. I still have my negative 5 or minus 5 term, and I still have 15 on the left-hand side. So now I have successfully combined the like terms. Are there any other like terms here? Well, 15 is alone on the left side of the equation, and on the right side, I have a 5x and a 5, which are not like terms because one is a variable and the other is a constant. So I am done with that tool. Now I just have to use the properties of equality. Go ahead and use the properties of equality to continue solving this equation now. Great job. So I chose to use the addition property of equality next to create a zero term. I simplified to get 20 equals 5x. Then I used the division property of equality to create a big one factor, and I ended up with 4 as my solution. I'm going to go ahead and check that now.
15 equals 3 times 4x minus 5 plus 2 times 4. We'll find out. 15 equals 12 minus 5 plus 8. That's 7 plus 8. And 7 plus 8 is 15.
So because it made the equation true, I know that 4 is the solution to this equation. And we use the combining like terms and properties of equality tools from our toolbox. On to the next one. So we now have an equation 15 equals 2 times the group of 3x minus 5. Go ahead and copy down this equation now. I'm going to put the line down the middle of my equal sign, and then I'm going to take a look at my toolbox here and figure out what tools I'm going to use. So the first tool is the combining like terms tool. So on the left side, I only see a constant of 15. There are no other terms there. And on the right side, I see a variable term and a constant, which means I'm not going to be combining like terms on the right side either. So it appears that I will not be using the combine like terms tool. What about the distributive property? Do you see parentheses in this equation? Yes, we do have parentheses in this equation, which means we will eventually use the distributive property. And then because we have variable terms and constants, we are also going to be using the properties of equality. So let's get started. I'm going to start by using my distributive property and multiplying 3x and minus 5 by 2. That would simplify to 6x minus 10 because 2 times 3x is 6x and 2 times 5 is 10. And the 15 on the other side is not affected. So I started with my given equation, and then I applied my distributive property. Now I have a pretty simple two-step equation to solve. Go ahead and finish solving this equation now. Great, let's see how you did. So next I chose to use APO and create a zero term. That left me with the equation 25 equals 6x. I used depot to create a big one, and I've got this nasty looking fraction that I get to check. Ooh, lucky me. So I'm going to go ahead and check that now.
15 equals 2 times 3 times 25 6 minus 5. Okay, now I notice here that 3 and 6 can be reduced down to 1 and 2. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this now. Now I have 15 equals 2 times 25 halves minus 5.
And I know that we're supposed to do parentheses first, but I don't really want to subtract 25 halves minus 5. So I'm going to simplify this using the distributive property.
So that's 2 times 25 over here, so the 2 will cancel. And I'll be left with 15 equals 25, and 2 times 5 is 10.
And 25 minus 10 is 15, which means 25/6 was the correct solution all along. And again, we were able to solve using our distributive property and properties of equality tool. Last example before we get into our workbook. 15 equals 2 times the group of x minus 5 plus 3x. Go ahead and copy down this equation and your 3-column proof now. Great. I'm going to start by putting a line down the middle of my equal sign. This one looks like it's got a lot going on. So let's take a look at our toolbox and figure out what tools we're going to use. Up first, will we be combining like terms here? Well, I only see 15 on the left, so I know that side doesn't have any. But on the right, I see an x term here inside of parentheses and an x term outside of parentheses. Because these are both like terms, that does lead me to believe that I will be using combined like terms at some point. Okay, what about the distributive property? Do you see any parentheses here? I do. I see parentheses right there in the middle, which means I will also be using my distributive property tool. And then again, because I've got a mixture of constants and variables, I'm going to have to create some big ones and zero terms using my properties of equality. So this equation is going to require all of the tools in our toolbox to solve. So let's get started. The first thing that I notice is that I have parentheses. And anytime you have parentheses, anything that's, unsimplified, I would suggest getting rid of those parentheses first. So the first tool that we're going to use is our distributive property. Notice that the only value that's being multiplied by 2 is that one term right there. This 3x is its own term off to the side. It's not being affected by that multiplication. So I'm going to apply the distributive property, but only to the term that is a product. So my first step here will be the distributive property. Let's simplify. 2 times x is a 2x, minus 2 times 5 is a 10. And then I can bring down my other term of plus 3x, and I can bring down the 15 that wasn't affected. So my distributive property tool has been used. I don't have any other parentheses to work with. What tool do you think we would use next? Well, believe it or not, you've got options. If you wanted to use combined like terms next, you would look at the 2x and the 3x and hope to combine them. Or if you want to use properties of equality next, you could add 10 to create a zero term and then continue solving. I would prefer to combine my like terms first, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. I have 2 x's plus 3 more x's, which combine to a single term of 5 x's. I'm going to bring down my minus 10 and my equals 15. Now that I've used my combine like terms tool, I only have one tool left in the toolbox, and that's our properties of equality. Now that this is a pretty simple two-step equation, why don't you finish solving? Okay, so after we did our distributive property and combined like terms, I chose to use APO to create a zero term, giving me a simplified equation of 25 equals 5x, followed by depot to create a big one factor, and I ended up with 5 equaling x I'm going to go ahead and check that work now.
15 equals 2 times 5 minus 5 plus 3 times 5. So 15 equals 2 times 0 plus 15. That's 15 equals 0 plus 15.
And 15 does equal 15, meaning that 5 is the correct solution to this equation. And that equation required every tool from that solving equations toolbox. Quick recap. So solving multi-step equations pretty much means you're going to be using all your tools in your toolbox, or at least most of them. So to determine if there's a combining like terms tool, you're looking for like terms on the same side. Those like terms could be variables or constants. Again, constant means it doesn't have a variable. To determine if you're going to use the distributive property tool, you look for parentheses. And properties of equality are used to create zero terms and big ones, keeping the equation true while you're doing so. That's it for today's lesson. I will see you next time.